I hope you're all ready for some side quests because we got some side quests to do here.
Yay.
Welcome back to the Final Fantasy VII Remake commentary.
But
And,
shouldn't we try to meet back up with Tifa and Barrett?
well, the excuse for having a side quest break here is that Aerith's mom is going to be making dinner. So, they're going to make dinner, so we're going to go out and do some stuff while she's cooking.
To pass the time.
Yeah. I mean, it's a long trip to Final Fantasy VII. It's a long trip to Sector 7 Slums. I mean, it wasn't in the original game, but let's be honest. The slums in the original game weren't exactly built to scale. So, Midgar felt a lot smaller than it was portrayed as being. And,
Maybe this is just my, my expectations when going into a game of that size, but it felt fairly big for at least the type of game it's supposed to be.
Yeah, for the type of game it was supposed to be, but you can get away with that kind of odd scaling in a game like Final Fantasy VII, in a JRPG in particular, especially older styled JRPGs. As the games got more detailed, like 8 and 9 did, they started doing things to sort of compensate for the increased realism, making it feel a bit weird. Like, you would see parts of the city that you couldn't access, that kind of thing. Esthar was literally just made the whole city part of the world map, and you could only enter certain parts of it as a regular field, for example. And in Lindblum, you traveled by train across the town, and you got the feeling from the way the backgrounds were drawn that you were only exploring a few streets of it. That sort of thing. The sort of thing they probably could have done with Midgar's top plates if they had tried at the time. And it's that sort of trick that you still sort of see here, because you're obviously not exploring all of Midgar, just a few parts of it. But
Yeah, original 7 on PlayStation was designed very much as a, what if we just made 6 but in 3D in terms of world scaling?
yeah, pretty much. I think there was a tech demo for it early on, actually, when they were trying to pitch it to Nintendo, where they literally just used Final Fantasy VI characters.
Which is always weird, like, looking back.
Yeah, pretty much. Obviously, though, that didn't go anywhere because Nintendo didn't want RPGs on their system for some reason.
It was more... It's not that. It was more because of the space limitations on the cartridges.
Oh, that was something that Square did cite as a reason for specifically going to the PlayStation, but I do remember also hearing that they pitched it to Nintendo, and Nintendo didn't really care much for it, and wow, that was a good business decision, wasn't it?
I think it's more about the space limitations, not so much Nintendo wasn't interested, because why wouldn't they? Because Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6 were beloved RPGs.
Well, it was more than one reason for Square's decisions at that time, but it did eventually end up in their favor because the PlayStation was very much better for the genre at the time.
I think Nintendo at that time made a lot of, in hindsight, poor decisions, because they really did push away a lot of third-party support on the N64, and one could argue they never really got it back.
A lot of companies will begrudgingly publish on Nintendo because the system at the time is successful, not because they like working with Nintendo.
Nintendo they've had this interesting habit of always doing something with their console's base design that limits what can be done with it. With the N64, it was sticking with cartridges, with when they knew full well CDs were on their way in. And then with the GameCube, it was, we're going to use half a DVD for our game disc. Why not? And then, of course, there's the Wii and the Wii U, which, we all know that history by now. The only time they've ever done anything that compensated for that properly was this generation with the Switch. I mean, the Switch does have...
And I mean, I guess, I don't know how well handhelds count, because for all intents and purposes, if you wanted a handheld game, Nintendo was the only.
Yeah, in
the
the handheld industry, they dominated, and it was everyone else trying and failing to compete with them.
Yeah.
Sony did to an extent, depending on what kind
they
of genre
tried.
you're
They
looking
did
for.
better than anyone else had.
Well,
up until that point.
Sony did well in Japan, I should say. The Vita.
Yeah, because the PSP and the Vita are really good RPG machines.
Yeah, the Vita and the PSP did well in Japan. Maybe not as well as they would have liked, and let's be real here. The video game industry in Japan does bank a lot on international success in order to keep going, but there are quite a few systems that did well in Japan that wouldn't have done well here.
Be still my heart, Rude.
He looks like Hitman.
Rude is great too.
Rude was always my favorite Turk.
That is a stylish suit.
Reno is kind of the in-your-face, sort of witty, one-liner kind of character, and he's amusing for that. Rude is entertaining for the more subtle stuff, and this is an aspect of Rude that didn't exist so much in the original game. It's actually a character trait that I would say he started to surface in him in Advent Children, because in the original game, Rude, again, bobbleheads with limited expressiveness, they couldn't really do this kind of thing with those characters.
He was just a straight man to Rude. I mean, to Reno.
Who did have a crush on Tifa, and that was only subtly implied through dialogue and through battle mechanics that you would never notice until someone pointed it out.
Wait, Rude won't hit Tifa if she's in your...
If you are in a party with Tifa, Rude will not attack Tifa unless she's the only person left.
I actually didn't know that. There's like there's a conversation you can hear between Elena, Rude, and Reno, but you might miss it because it's in a place where you don't actually have to go in order to finish the game. It's in Gongaga, which you can skip straight. You can skip straight past it and head straight to Cosmo Canyon. So it's an optional sequence where they're talking about people they like, and Rude admits to liking Tifa, which is really entertaining if you have Tifa in your party all the time, like I do. Like, she doesn't react at all.
That's real though. Has anybody actually ever just skipped the Gongaga reactor? Just like on the overworld map, they see it, it's like, oh, that's neat, and they just move on. Let's ignore the burning wreckage. You're weird.
The first time I played the game, I was just rushing through because I was a little kid and I was bad at video games. I didn't even notice that it was there. So
well, you see, when I was a kid for a lot of games like that, I always did everything I possibly could. Partially just because, like, I often just thought that doing the main story was boring, and I wanted to do everything else I possibly could first. So I guess it just depends on, like, but I also think it's possible, especially if you're young, to just miss some of that kind of stuff. You know?
It's because, well, I mentioned this before, but my dad didn't know what save points were when I was a kid. So the first time I played an RPG was Final Fantasy VIII. I did the whole Dalit mission at the start, giant robot spider and everything. And then I lost all that progress because my dad wouldn't let me save my game before turning off the system. It would have taken me 5 minutes. God damn it.
My parents still make fun of me for saying if I'm playing Pokemon and I'm in the middle of a fight, I can't save the game.
Yeah,
they're all like, "Oh, you can't save during a battle." And I'm like, "Yes, I can't save during a battle, and I'm not leaving my Game Boy, which doesn't have a proper battery indicator on it, lying down on the table
for hours on end."
Yeah, well, I need to go and do something.
My dad said to me once while I was playing Wild Arms, I was going through a dungeon fighting random battles, and I told him that I wanted to save my game, and he said, "What's it matter? There's always gonna be another fight, right? It doesn't end." And I'm like,
oh, my mom did that to me too when I was playing. When my brother was really young, he was probably 2 years old. He deleted all of the save data on my GameCube memory card. And I got really mad at him about that, and it's like, "Oh, so you just have to play the game again?" And I'm like, "No, that's not how it is. It's not like a DVD player where you can fast forward."
These aren't NES games where you can beat them.
I
in 40
had
minutes.
to explain to my dad at a restaurant once. This was like in the early PS3 days, mind you, that games have stories now, and there's an ending, and you play through the story, and it's really interesting, and I was having fun with it.
No, it's all beep boops like Pac-Man. Every game is Pac-Man.
I feel like you have to be really out of touch to not know that games have stories.
Nowadays, I feel that's not an issue anymore.
It's more so our parents' generation, where it's like, oh, the story is Mario gets to the end and boop, drops Bowser into some lava, saves the princess, and that's about it.
My dad's experience with video games was with the Atari 2600.
There you go. Then that's perfect. Then But I feel like every generation, any parent that's above the age of 30 or 40, that they know. Like,
yeah, like when I tried having a conversation about video games at one point in relatively recent years, and I talked about the Wii. He told me like it really appealed to him because he liked the idea of those simpler games. And I really didn't know how to. I really didn't know how to broach the topic of how the specific kind of simpler games that the Wii had tends to be cheaply thrown together garbage.
Well, I'm gonna disagree there because simple doesn't necessarily.
Oh no, it doesn't. It doesn't. But at the time, with the Wii's library in particular, it tended to be more often than not that games were thrown together.
Well, I don't think that has anything to do with how simple they are, because if you look at a game like, say, Carnival games on the Wii, I mean, the concept is really simple. Like, okay, you're just emulating basic Carnival games on the Wii, but the way that they, like, made the controls for it far overcomplicated them than they needed to. Making something simple does not necessarily mean it's easy. Like, the best example I've ever heard of is running a marathon is simple, because all you have to do is keep running until you finish. But that doesn't mean that it's easy.
I know that, but it seems like in more recent times, developers have lost the art of making effective, simple games. Like, the only one I can think of off the top of my head that still kind of works is fucking Bomberman. But
yeah, I've noticed that you have a trend of either not bothering to simplify it, so you get games with a million different button combinations. Just say, here, this is how the buttons are mapped. Or you kind of do what Nintendo's done a few times, where it's like, let's map everything to one button because it's easy. And it's like, no, you're making it really hard to do what you need to do because everything's mapped to one button.
I mean,
it's mechanically cumbersome.
I mean, there are some things. It's weird because there are examples that I can think of that somewhat contradict themselves. Like, your typical Musou style of game is fairly simple, I would say. You know, the combat is pretty straightforward because you mash one button until you want to finish your combo, and then you mash a different button. But then there's also a lot of, like, really complex other stuff in the side modes, like needing to level up your character and stuff, so yeah.
I set myself up for this perfect teamwork play where Aerith lays down the goddamn arcane ward, and Cloud uses a double blizzard on the hedgehog pies that are weak to ice, and of course one of them sucker punches me in the face with a fire spell the moment my blizzard is about to go off and cancels it.
Oops.
Duh. Piece of shit hedgehog pies.
I guess I'm grateful that I'm grateful that I had a set of parents that didn't really belittle me for my enjoyment of video games. Like, besides the one or two times they would tell me, you know, you should probably like go outside and play some basketball, which is fair. You know, physical activity is good every once in a while. They never viewed like what I did as lesser than like reading a book or watching a movie.
I mean, kids should read more. But
I mean, you can do lots of reading in games, so it kind of works out that way. Where it's like, oh, you need to read more. Pokemon's like 90% reading.
Yeah, but I'm not gonna. I hate being that guy, but like, I think that kids should also read more substantial stuff.
Oh no, that's fair. I'm just saying, is like when you're grade school, it's more about learning the actual method of comprehending reading,
vernacular and comprehension. Yeah,
getting to the point where you can just look at a wall of text and immediately pick things out. You know.
I'm thinking more about like the kids who are 9 at the moment, who already know how to read and should do more reading because it's good for them.
Well, there's knowing how to read, and then there's being so used to reading that it just flows into your brain the moment it hits your eyeballs. There's more than one level of it. So
reading comprehension comes at many different stages in life.
Yeah, it's just this is, you know, the
I'm not saying gaming is a replacement for reading. Just gaming can very much help with reading comprehension because kids are more actively engaged with it.
Yeah, it's just like I get there's like my brother who's 18 at the moment, like he says, "Oh, reading sucks. It's not fun." Whenever he's told to read a book for school or whatever, and it's just depressing because you should read books. They're good for you. And they're fun, and you can.
But I wouldn't say that's necessarily a new thing, though, Ted. That goes back as old as time, I feel.
Well, because schools
It's always
always
good.
make you read a lot of crap you don't want to read.
Because it's all tied to school. You read all the time in school. And it's like when you're at home, the last thing you want to do is read.
Yeah, if it's a good book, like they everybody cheers when they bring out the TV to watch TV during
Matt
class. And it's not like you're sick of watching TV during school because you do it so much at home.
Well, because you so rarely get to watch TV in school. So.
And TV is more visually stimulating than
Well,
text on a
a
page.
TV day in a classroom was always a win-win for everyone because the people who cared about whatever was being shown could watch it, and the people who didn't care about being shown, well, you don't have to respond to a television, do you? So you can just tune out and pretend to watch, but you're really just sort of napping with your
I
eyes
tuned
open.
out and just doodled on a notebook, yeah.
Although I did actually enjoy the few times that they brought a TV out in my classroom. Like they always, I had good luck with teachers who would pick out good shit for us to enjoy.
Time for a nap.
Like
We got Bill Nye the Science Guy all the way up until 10th grade.
surprisingly,
which is surprising.
I didn't watch too many Bill Nye episodes in the classroom. It came up a few times, but only a few times. Like they did it a lot in Latchkey, I think, but not in actual classrooms, which is odd. Everyone talks about how like they watched so much Bill Nye the Science Guy in the classroom, but that in particular didn't happen for me.
Bill Nye talks, I get paid.
But like my English teacher in 5th grade, rather than like apparently, I guess she was aware of the problem of teachers assigning their kids horrible old-timey books that nobody cares about reading at that age, and just went out of her way to lend students copies of the Harry Potter novels that were out at the time, which was just the first 3. It was that early on. And
I mean, I remember when the first one came out, and all the teachers were like, "You're reading trash. This isn't good. You should be reading the school assigned books." And it's like,
well,
just be thankful they're reading.
Yeah, you have to meet the kids on their level, which is why, the teachers who, like, I did have elementary school teachers who got mad when I was reading, like, Animorphs or Captain Underpants in class, and it's like, why don't you, like, try to meet me halfway here, please? Like, I'm
Or
9.
Captain Boxers there. Can
No.
you give me that at least?
Did you know that a bunch of people got really mad at Captain Underpants a couple of books ago because there's a time travel plot and one of the characters go into the future and one of the kids ends up there's just a scene where the 2 kids are adults and they're sitting with their spouses and one of them married a man, and they don't mention it other than that it said like they said bye to his wife and his husband and him or whatever, and then of course the crazy
moral guardian-
right
moral guardian
Christian
police.
people were like, you can't have this in Captain Underpants, the series where there's giant talking toilets that try to take over the town and booger people from space. This is corrupting the children, they say.
Says a book about a man who runs around in his underwear.
Have you watched the DreamWorks movie? It's surprisingly good.
I've only seen bits and pieces. I love how it's animated.
The animation's great.
Well, they used the penis animation, wasn't it?
Very similar technique. There's also a random scene where they just switch to sock puppets for no reason, which is also really funny.
Fuck Smoggers.
the Smoggers, I was gonna say.
Smoggers piss me off for one reason and one reason only. It's not because they're tough encounters. You can take them pretty down. You can take them down pretty easily with magic. It's that they have a chance of self-destruction after you kill them.
Yeah.
And it's the only time in the game where something blowing up at the end of their death hurts. Need I remind you that you already fought like countless atomic sweepers at this point who blow up just the same but doesn't do anything.
The kind of mechanical issue with that is that adding self-destruct to the end of a Smogger battle like that, You see,
Well, they very clearly say self-destruct. It's obviously dangerous.
but what makes it any different than an atomic sweeper blowing up that doesn't
it
hurt
might
you?
be off camera when that happens.
Yeah,
Yes.
when you're in a fight with more than one,
You're already
thing
out
on
of
screen.
battle, which means that 1, you can't control anyone but Cloud, and 2, the other character isn't using their AI script that makes them dodge and block AoE effects automatically. So the character might just be sitting there, and they'll take the explosion to the face, and it's annoying. It probably won't kill them. In fact, I'm pretty sure nothing can kill you outside of battle. You'll just have 1 HP or something. But it's like it's really, really pointless. And they can't let you stay in battle until the self-destruct happens either, because that would give away immediately that that's what's about to happen. So it just seems like such a pointless, silly inclusion that doesn't functionally work for what it should work for, you know? It's just weird. Weird design. Oh well.
Hey, what were we talking about earlier? Overly Christian giant toilet bowls or something?
Yeah. You know how it is.
Back to the tangents, huh? Well, I mean, we're climbing around on storage containers in the Sector 5 slums.
Yeah, what the hell you want to talk
so,
about? Want to talk about the texture of the Shinra thing? Nice texture.
more of that hold this button to do the thing mechanics.
It's sensitive to context.
It's you know, it's good to be able to do things other than just walk from A to B in order to get through an area, because that is a lot of what made Final Fantasy XIII so dull, that you only ever really seemed to jog from A to B most of the time, with very little variation in what you did to get through a particular area.
Well, I can never even really think of anything in Final Fantasy XIII that really felt like a set piece, though. It really did. That was
It was just
playable.
hallways.
Like, there was nothing like doing these monkey bars here, or like even the scene in the church from last part. I can't really think of anything like that in Final Fantasy XIII. It was flashy stuff did happen, but it was almost always relegated to cutscenes, from what I can remember.
There were some neat scenery set pieces, but I emphasize scenery set pieces because they're only set pieces in the sense of being an interesting thing to look at in a particular part of a particular map. Whereas you didn't really do much. Like, if you were lucky, they would have an auto-jumping sequence, or you would run across a big old thick steel cable or something, and the camera would sweep out dramatically to make it look dangerous and important, even though
Final Fantasy XIII is a great looking game. I haven't looked at it in a while, but it probably still holds up visually today.
It does. It actually really does. Final Fantasy XIII on a technical level is interesting because it's an early PS3 game with no mandatory install that loads fine and plays smoothly. Which didn't happen a lot in early PS3 games, I'm going to say. So it deserves to be commended for that.
I'd love to see what the difference is between it and the Xbox version that needed, 6 discs or whatever.
I think the Xbox version suffered somewhat for that, like some cutscenes were pre-rendered or something, rather than being real-time. But apart from that, I can't really think of a difference.
It's just, it's very clear where their efforts were put, which is a shame because while definitely Final Fantasy had a reputation for being the prettier games, I would say.
Yeah.
I'd say after the SNES era, because on SNES I would actually say that Dragon Quest on average was better looking than Final Fantasy, but starting with the PlayStation 1, if you look at Dragon Quest VII on the PlayStation 1, that game came out, I think, a year before Final Fantasy X, and it's kind of laughable if you compare those two. But, Final Fantasy VII was good looking for the time, but also 8 and 9 are fantastic for the time. 10 looks really good, 12 looks really good, but I never thought that they ever felt like games that were about graphics more than gameplay. They were just games that had really, really nice graphics. And I feel like 13 is the only time where more effort was put into the art than into making it a substantial play experience.
Or even a substantial narrative experience, to be honest. The thing about Final Fantasy is that, with the exception of 12, which went in an odd direction mechanically for the series, and with the exception of Final Fantasy XI, which was a really in-depth and time-consuming MMORPG from the EverQuest days, and nothing was ever convenient in the EverQuest days. Final Fantasy is the digestible JRPG series. It's the series that doesn't really go too deep into mechanics or too deep into super complex story stuff. It's really easy for most people to get into a Final Fantasy game and just enjoy the ride without too much worry. There's usually optional content for those who really want to sink their teeth into it, but for the most part, it's
I would agree with that, yes.
yeah. So keeping that in mind, it actually does make a lot of sense for Final Fantasy to have veered off in this more action-y direction over time. That it was part of the reason, I think, that the ATB system was introduced, and it's a major part of the reason why, after 12, they started to experiment with this system where you're only controlling one character and you're more directing the flow of battle. And in Final Fantasy VII Remake's case, we're trying to sort of marry these menu-based tactical decisions to a action RPG system.
Can I just, brief side tangent, can I just say I'm really glad that the idea that just a game, an RPG with menus, and you just do the combat through menus isn't, like, considered a faux pas anymore. I'm really glad about that.
Well, I think Square for a while kind of was like, okay, fine, you can have them.
Like, I remember how begrudgingly
yeah.
it was that Bravely Default came out.
There's kind of this attitude, especially in the West, where RPG turn-based combat is boring and you're always doing the same thing and you're just fighting random battles.
I don't know where that came from though, because I don't remember people actually having that opinion.
Yeah, also considering 7 took off
It
as well
came
as it
from
did, and it
people
was
who don't
literally
like
that.
the genre being kind of salty that they don't like the genre, basically.
Okay, cool. Those are the people that bought 7, though. So
Yeah.
I take their word with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's one of those, I think Square just finally had to just face reality and look at the numbers where, yeah, 7 Remake or Kingdom Hearts can sell really well, but they also take a ton of money to make. Meanwhile, we can sell, Bravely Default or Octopath Traveler that still look really nice for their systems they're on,
Yeah.
and may not sell 10, 15 million units that 7 Remake will, but they still sell like 3 million units, which is a much higher return on investment for what we put into it.
Yeah. The thing about it, though, is that the people who talk about how much they dislike turn-based combat aren't really thinking about what makes turn-based combat tick. So they're not really thinking about, okay, how can we do this stuff better? They're just thinking entirely about the things that they don't like about the turn-based games they've tried and attributing it to the turn-based combat concept as a whole. So
I kind of feel like these are the type of people who only ever used the Charmander they got in Pokemon and never caught anything else. That's the people who don't want to try the other things in their spell menu and then grind and complain when they can't beat the boss because they didn't try.
Well, I mean, it's not like there aren't games that do the things that they accuse them of.
Oh, there absolutely
there
are,
and
yes.
many of them are quite popular with fans of the series. For example, Final Fantasy VII. But around the time Persona 5 came out, you got a lot of videos by people on YouTube talking about how they don't like turn-based RPGs, but this one made them like it. Persona 5 doesn't do anything particularly special. In fact, it does the same thing that the 2 Persona games directly before it did, just with smoothed out design because they know how to work the formula better.
It's the Fire Emblem Awakening for Persona games. It's the exact same game they've always made. It's just way more convenient to do shit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
pretty much. You shine it up a little bit, and then people are much more willing to play.
Well, I would say that in Persona 5's case, they also amped up the tactical depth of the formula that they had invented. But whereas
Generally speaking, that's what it is. So.
yeah, whereas Awakening was kind of an easier game overall than
Well, I
previous
think
ones.
I think that also does have something to do with it because a lot of the Fire Emblem games were really hard, and Fire Emblem also at that point.
Sort of. I mean, they're easier Fire Emblem games. I wouldn't say Awakening's easier than, say, Sacred Slums.
I should amend my statement. Awakening has an easier introductory difficulty curve than, say, a Path of Radiance or something, which
Yes.
establishes its gameplay mechanics fairly quickly and then gets difficult. It takes a bit longer for Awakening to hit that difficult point, and by then you probably have a better handle on things than you do in Path of Radiance.
I'm not I'm not a huge Fire Emblem fan. I've played like half of Sacred Stones. I don't remember that game being as easy to break as Fire Emblem Awakening though, because in Fire Emblem Awakening, especially when you start getting your kids,
The para mechanic absolutely breaks Awakening, yes.
yeah, like that game's really easy to break in half once you know which characters like pair well together, and even if you get like a couple of levels ahead and you have Donald like absolutely breaking crap in half, and if you know what you're doing with breeding, and I know that sounds really weird in a game about actual people, but shush. At least they're not in the baby dimension.
Well, when you're playing with a guide, though, which is essentially what you have to be doing to know all that stuff, then of course it's easy. If you're playing with the Fire Emblem Awakening children and parent thing going entirely blind, then probably the only thing that you're likely to get by accident is if you're playing as female Robin, possibly the best Lucina. But
oh god, I forget. Do people like Crom and Olivia, I think, is considered one of the best pairings, but in order to do that, you have to have Crom be afraid of cooties and literally not talk to any woman for the first 13 chapters of the game, because Olivia meets Crom in literally the last possible chapter before he can get married, and she also needs to support up with him, so you have to basically attach the two at the hip in the very last chapter, and then Crom, dealing with the grief of his sister dying, just hooks up with the random pink-haired dancer that he met 10 minutes ago. Okay, sure.
well,
Fire Emblem Awakening's a weird game. I should try to re-record it. I recorded the game for BrainScratch 8 years ago.
I really wish they'd do a Switch version of Awakening.
I think that it would be a great remake. On the other hand, there's other games that they should remake first, like Roy's game and
Path of Radiance, please.
The Path of Radiance games, and I forget the name of it. The Genealogy of the Holy War or some shit like that.
Those games could largely just be ported without much fanfare or without much development effort, just to make it work smoothly. But the DS and 3DS games,
they could do what they did with the first game, and do that with the SNES games that we didn't get. Although preferably not having it just on the shop for 5 minutes like they did with the first NES game. But that's a different discussion altogether.
Indeed. Well, also that was a nice view from the top of Aerith's house, wasn't it? Pity we didn't talk about it.
You have a waterfall?
Aerith's house, well, I guess I'll have a moment to talk about that when we watch the next part, but it's purty.